to welcome Francis Tyers as our second speaker. Fran is currently an assistant professor at the Indiana University in Bloomington, or more currently at sabbatical in Mexico. He's received his PhD from University of Alicante in Spain. And in the meantime, since his PhD, he's been working in various places: Istanbul, Tromsø, Moscow. I don't know how many of those I forgot. And working and in Alicante, actually, he was one of the most significant persons behind the well-known Apertium machine translation system. But since then, he's been working on various aspects of morphology and syntax of mostly endangered languages or low-resource languages. And he's been a colleague and friend of us in the Universal Dependencies project, where he's contributed to many different languages. Because usually when he works on an endangered language, then there's a corpus as a result. So there's work on Breton and North Sami and Chukchi and then Yupik and in the American Indian languages and so on and so forth. So I would say, with probably just a bit of exaggeration, that there are just two types of languages: those that Fran has already worked on and those that he will be working on in the near future. So thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for the very kind introduction. And maybe I would say those that Fran has annotated and those that he's yet to annotate. Okay, yes, I'm Francis Tyers from the Department of Linguistics in Indiana University. As Dan rightly mentioned, this semester I'm on sabbatical in Mexico, and I'm living in this beautiful town, which is called Tetela de Ocampo, which is in the Sierra of Puebla, which is kind of to the east of Mexico City. So here's an outline for the talk. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Mesoamerica and some of the languages spoken there. Then I'm going to talk about some aerial features of these languages. Then I'm going to talk about why this actually matters to people like us who are working on language technology. Then I'm going to discuss some representations we came up with for supporting these features in universal dependencies. And then I'm going to give some concluding remarks. But before that, I'd like to give a bit of background as to why I'm talking to you about this. So I've been working on languages in Mesoamerica for a couple of years now. I started working on Quiche, which is a language of Guatemala, in 2020, kind of the end of 2020, basically. And I worked on a tree bank and also organized a workshop on syntactic annotation, basically doing UD annotation for indigenous languages of Mexico and Mesoamerica in Chiapas in November last year. Since then, I've also been to Huave speaking area and have been learning Huave. And right now I'm learning two kinds of Nahuatl. And because unfortunately I have speakers who speak one, but was only able to find a teacher for a different one. So I'm learning two at the same time. So without much further ado, let's look at Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica is an area, like a cultural historical area, that stretches from the north of Mexico up here, like near the border, down to the top of Honduras and El Salvador. It includes Mexico, Guatemala, and then parts of, well, most of Belize and parts of El Salvador and Honduras. I like to give a historical overview because some of you may not be familiar with the history of Mesoamerica. So the first agriculture was around 8000 BCE. There have been constant complex civilizations in the area, starting from around 1500 BCE to the present. So I'd like to pick out some of these. The first one was the Olmec. I don't know if you've seen these giant heads that they produced, but if you Google Olmec heads, you'll see what I mean. It's pretty impressive. The Maya were the first to come up with a writing system. in around 1500 BC or 500 BC, depending on how you count it. Teotihuacan, which is the next one there, was one of the biggest cities in the world at the time. So it had over 100,000, population of 100,000 when London was still, I don't know, 20,000 or something. And then El Tajín is kind of towards the east. The Mixtec and Zapotec are kind of in the center. And then the Aztecs you're probably all familiar with. So here's kind of a geographical spread of that. So you can see Teotihuacan is around here. The Olmecs were down here. Maya area basically stretches from the Yucatan Peninsula down through Guatemala and the top of El Salvador and Honduras. And then the Mixtecs and Zapotecs are in the center here. So there was, as I mentioned, independent invention of writing. So the pre-colonial period had a variety of writing systems, including pictographic, ideographic. So the difference between pictographic and ideographic is pictographic gives you kind of pictures that you use to tell a story, whereas ideographic is something that you can actually reproduce exactly what was said. The ideographic ones were mostly on the rebus principle, and they also had syllabic writing systems. So if people aren't familiar with the rebus principle, I'm going to ask you to try and pronounce these words. So what's this? B, okay, what's this? So what's this word? Belief, okay, next one. Treason. Okay, next. Seal. Ant. Sealant. But you could also go with silent, I mean. And I saw. So the ideographic writing systems were kind of based on this this principle. So I wanted to take a quick closer look at the Maya writing. So this was the most advanced and the earliest as well. It was a combination of logographic and syllabic, and had hundreds of logograms and syllabograms. So I'm going to start at the top corner. This is kind of a busy slide. I'm going to start here, and then go here, and then here. Actually, no, I'm going to start here. So this is the word balam, which means jaguar. And you can see that this kind of looks like a jaguar head, right? But in order to disambiguate this sign, you could also add an affix here that was the syllabic BA. And so this would be written babalam, but just means balam with a note to say, oh, by the way, this word definitely begins with B. You could also have that at the end. So ma at the end to indicate that the word definitely ends with ma. And then you could also just write it completely syllabically. So balama, for example. This shows you all of the possibilities. So here you have the main sign, and you can add these disambiguating prefixes all around. You can also have a disambiguating infix. So they're trying to encode this in Unicode at the moment, but they probably won't get around to being able to do infixes. And then these are all of the kinds of configurations that you can find. The books that they had were written on these kind of folding concertina type codices. And a few of them still survive. But after the contact with the Spanish burnt nearly all of them. So there were probably tens of thousands of books that were just destroyed. But you can see like they're pretty beautiful. And I would encourage you to look up Mayan codices. They're very, very interesting. So after the Spanish contact, the languages continued to be written, but then written in Latin script. This is an example from the Florentine Codex, which is kind of like a enormous encyclopedia of all of the pre-contact knowledge of culture that was developed by indigenous scribes and different monks, basically friars. Then you have annals, which are year by year kind of reports of what happened in that year, including things like, in this year, nothing happened. But they have every year, and then sometimes things just don't happen. And then mundane documents, and by that I mean wills, like last will and testament, bills of sale, land records, all of these kind of things. There's also collections of poetry, pre-contact poetry, and songs and things like that as well. I'm in Prague, so I think I don't need to tell you about universal dependencies. But okay, I will. For those of you who are connecting via Zoom. Universal Dependencies is a global project to develop annotation guidelines and to validate and distribute tree banks. Fortunately, the v2.10 isn't out, so I didn't have to change this slide. But as of November last year, there were 122 languages. I think that's now 150 or so, and 217 tree banks. And I don't know how many tree banks there will be in the next release, which is happening yesterday. This is a map that I produced in 2020 with the tree banks that were around at the time. Things have improved since then, and by improved I mean there are more tree banks. But there's still very little in many areas of the world. For example, in Mesoamerica, and it would be 0 if I hadn't have developed this Quiche tree bank last year. Also in Africa, it's looking kind of good, right? But you have to think that in Cameroon, there are like 250 languages spoken, and so 4 is not not a great number, especially when you look at how Europe is doing, for example. Okay, so the talk is going to look at 3 main languages, and I'm going to discuss them a bit here. But first, I'm going to tell you a bit about all of the languages that are spoken in Mesoamerica. So you have a nice map here of some of the main families, and the way that the linguists and the state organizations divide up what's a language and what's not a language and what's a family, etc., is a bit different from how it works over here. And so they talk in terms of 7 major language families, which you'll probably be familiar with. So for example, Uto-Aztecan, like Nahua, or like Ute in the US, Mayan, Oto-Manguean, etc. So these are like big language families, like you might think Turkic or Uralic or Indo-European, for example. And then you have around 100 linguistic groupings. Now, these could either be families, like, for example, Romance or Slavic, or they could be macro languages, like, for example, Arabic. Those are kind of mushed together. And then you have 400 linguistic variants, which could be either languages. So it could be like, for example, Spanish or French or Norwegian, or they could be dialects, like, for example, Swiss German, for example. So it's whenever you're trying to say, oh, there are this many languages in Mesoamerica, it's always difficult because you're dealing with these like different ways of organizing them. So in terms of the geography, the Mayan languages are mostly spoken in the south, like I mentioned before. In the north, it's mostly Uto-Aztecan, and then in the middle, it's a mix of Oto-Manguean and Uto-Aztecan. So I'm going to, as I said, talk about 3. The first is, pardon me, Nahuatl, which is a linguistic grouping. You will often hear it talked of as if it were a language, but it's really more like Romance, for example. Or if there were some kind of standard that everyone knew, then it would be something like Arabic. There are around 1.5 million speakers of all of the variants of Nahuatl. It's polysynthetic, has nominative accusative alignments. It's spoken in central Mexico and the Gulf Coast here. So this is the state of Puebla, where I'm living at the moment. And I would say it has of all of the languages in Mesoamerica, it has the largest corpus of texts because it was kind of secondary official language for most of the colonial period. So you would have Spanish and then you would have Nahuatl, even in communities that were not necessarily Nahuatl speaking. So the examples will be from Western Sierra Puebla Nahuatl, which is now the longest name of a language in Universal Dependencies. And that is this red area here. This is the state of Puebla, and you can see that this map to the right is like the top half of that. And there are 4 varieties of Nahuatl spoken in that area. So I'm somewhere around here. Yes, okay. The second language is Huave, which is a language isolate. It's spoken by around 20,000 speakers in the south of Oaxaca on the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's agglutinative and nominative accusative. And it's one of the few languages few indigenous languages in Mexico that's really spoken at all levels of society. So when you go to a village and the kids are talking to each other, like 5- and 6-year-olds, like they're playing together and they're speaking the language. This is extremely unusual in Mexico, but it's like very common in San Mateo del Mar, for example. So this is kind of a zoom in on this area in the south of Oaxaca. This is San Mateo del Mar and its outlying villages. And all of the examples are going to be from this variety. The other varieties are San Francisco del Mar, Santa Maria del Mar, and San Dionisio del Mar. But the language in those communities is much more shifted to Spanish. And finally, Quiche is spoken in Guatemala by around 1 million speakers. There's a lot of mutually intelligible varieties, but it has a broadly accepted standard and a standard that's supported by state bodies, a single standard that's supported by state bodies. It's agglutinative, ergative, absolutive, and VOS. So this is a map of Guatemala. You can see here's Mexico, here's Belize, and Quiche is spoken up here in this area. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about some aerial features. I'm going to talk a bit about constituent order, polypersonal agreements, head marking, relational nouns incorporation, and contact phenomena and variation. So to start with constituent order, basic order of constituents. There are very many verb-initial languages in Mesoamerica. So this is kind of in terms of the entire globe, it's unusual. In terms of Europe, it's very unusual. I think you only have the Celtic languages that are verb-initial. This is a map from Wales. The little yellow circles are VSO. The diamonds are VOS. This is SVO and this is SOV. A lot of those in Wales are not particularly reliable data points, as we will come to see later, because they just choose one, usually the oldest description, which is not necessarily the most accurate or best one. But in general, the word order is often flexible, and there's lots of features like clefting and fronting and focus and stuff like that. Incidentally, before Quiche, I think there were no treebanks that were VOS in UD. So another feature is polypersonal agreement. And so this means that verbs or predicates agree with both, well, transitive verbs agree with both the subject and the object, and sometimes they also agree with the indirect object. The example here is from Quiche. All of the examples, by the way, will have a little language code up there. So you can tell which example they're from, which language they're from. So this is 68A is an intransitive verb. And you can see that it has an agreement marker, which is in, which is the first person singular. And then in B, it's a transitive verb, and you can see that the same in is used for the object marking. This agreement can also be defective, like in the case of Huave. Here we have, I saw the dogs, and you only get this object marking if the subject, like you only get a plural object marking if the subject is singular. So those are the only instances in which you get double, like polypersonal agreement. And you also have different orthographic representations. So sometimes they're written all together, sometimes they're written apart, sometimes one bit is on the verb and another bit is written apart, but they're always obligatory. So head marking, what do I mean by this? The best way to look at this is looking at the example of possession, where the possessed thing is marked and not the possessor. So if you want to say my father's shoes, you say his shoes, my father. Or if you want to say Maria's son's clothes, you say his clothes, her son, Maria. So instead of the second noun being marked, like with the of preposition in English, it's the first noun that's marked with an agreement marker. And this is unusual in UD. Sometimes you have like double marking, like in Finnish or in Turkish, or you have dependent marking. So there are very few adpositions in the Mesoamerican languages, some or cases even. There are some exceptions. Purepecha, which is a language isolate, has cases, but it's the only example I know of. And then many of the languages will have one preposition or two prepositions. But like all of the other kind of spatial relations or relations between things are done with relational nouns. And these relational nouns are very much like in Turkish. So if you say aramızda, then this means between us, literally between, like between our in, so in our between us. Or if you look at English or Spanish, like on top of it or in front of it. But instead of being used for just these like specific spatial relations, it's used for all the spatial relations and also for things like with or using, or even for quantifiers in some case. They're often derived from body parts. They're morphologically nominal. They take possessive morphology. They can contract with real adpositions. So for example, if the language has these one or two adpositions, they will contract with them. In the Nahuatl languages, they can also compound with nouns. And I'll show an example of that. And they can also be fronted in Nahuatl or inverted with pied piping in Quiche. So you can see here, they will put you on top of the metate is put with a second person plural, and then it's on metate. So, and then you can drop the complement and it's still grammatical. So I want to play with you is want me it, me play you with, or you're with, basically. So more examples. This slide is also a bit busy, so but the examples are numbered. The first one is with pied piping. So normally you get the relational noun and then its complement. But if you have this fronting with an interrogative pronoun, then the relational noun comes afterwards. So instead of being with whom, it's who with, for example. Then 5 is an example of contraction. In the first one, you have no contraction. So Tuyul, Mikambayat in our village, or it can be just Ti Mikambat. Then in Nahuatl, you have this compounding. So Nehnika Kalichtik is I am indoors, and this indoors is really house inside. And you could also switch that out. So it could be Ihtikali, for example. So it's just a compound of these two. And you can also have fronting where the complement is separated from the relational noun by a verb or by a clause or by whatever. So I'm going to chat with my mom. Iwan nimononsas no mama. It's a possessive with, her with. My mom, I'm going to chat. And then we have incorporation. So this is a productive process of noun-verb or verb-verb compounding. If the thing incorporated is the verb's object, then the verb changes valency from transitive to intransitive. And this happens in Nahuatl, but not in Quichua Huave. And doing this is considered to be very fine style if you're speaking or if you're writing. So in this example, my mum used to give us boots in order to not get our feet wet. It's my mum gave us some boots so that they feet make wet. So this feet is the object of make wet, which is a causative, and this is an intransitive subject agreement. You also have many loan words in all kinds of different directions. I bring out 3 here because that's all that will fit on the slide. So there are many examples of Nahuatl loan words in other languages of Mesoamerica. So for example, Nahuatl in Zapotec or Nahuatl in Huave. This example is pineapple. Matzahtli is matzaicht in Huave. And then almost, or not say, I'm not going to say almost all, but very many words that end in TE in Spanish. And they came after the 1500s are loanwords from Nahuatl, where the word ends in TL. So you're probably familiar with coyote, for example, coyotl in Nahuatl, or avocado, aguacate in Spanish, and aguacatl in Nahuatl. So if you see TE on the end, it's probably a Nahuatl loanword. And then, of course, in the other direction as well, the word caballo in Nahuatl is from the Spanish caballo, because there were no horses before the Spanish came. And of course, most of the languages are regularly mixed with Spanish and vice versa. Here's an example from a spoken text. So the parts in orange are in Spanish, the parts in black are in Nahuatl, and you can see that you have like either long stretches or single words, like especially function words like porque, because, or mientras, while. And then you also have Nahuatl prefixes on Spanish words. So no alarma, like my alarm, and tu compadre, our compadre. And then variation. I'm not going to talk about lexical, morphological, or syntactic variation. We don't have enough time. And also universal dependencies mostly deals with this in a fairly transparent manner. But orthographic variation is a real challenge. So there are very different degrees of orthographic standardization. In the best case, you have a single standard supported and promoted by both the community and by community and state organizations. So in Guatemala, there is a language academy for the Mayan languages, which is kind of a federative organization, and each of the individual linguistic communities has its own organization, which is federated with this state organization. They promulgate a standard, which has come about by consensus, and everyone's happy and is mostly working within that standard. For Huave, there's a single standard per variant, so each of the towns has its own standard, but it's mostly come about by consensus, by people just writing and deciding, oh, we want to write it this way, etc. And everyone largely agrees with it. With Nahuatl, it's definitely not like that. There are both multiple standards, and they're from multiple state organs. And there are different standards by community or author or person. And the same person might write differently, like one day to the next. So here's an example. The sentence is, he perked up his ears and started to ask. This also has an incorporation. Nakas is the word for ears. We have here three different organizations. So this is the Summer Institute of Linguistics. This is the Public Education Secretariat. And this is the National Institute of Indigenous Languages. And then this is the kind of academic, like North American academic system for writing Nahuatl. And then this is my Nahuatl teacher, Pedro Rivera. And this is Mitsuya Sasaki, who is one of our colleagues, who is a Japanese researcher. And you can see they all have a different way of writing. Like they're fairly simple differences. So for S, you either have S, Z, or C. For K, you either have K, Q, U, or C. For W, you either have W, U, or HU. For H, you have H or J. And for TS, you either have TS or TZ. But all of this, these differences makes it really difficult to process the text in any sensible way. So in our tree banks, what we've done is basically leave the text in the original orthography and do all of the annotation in that particular orthography. And then try and figure it out later, basically. Note that these are not all of the variants. These are just a selection of them. Some of the prefixes can sometimes be written separately, depending on the author. And sometimes they may change in the same text. So they might say, oh, great, well, now instead of using H, we're going to use J, for example. Okay, so that's like a big information dump. And so now I'm going to talk a bit about why, at least I think this matters, and I think you should think this matters as well. So there are four main areas. One is quantitative and comparative linguistics. Another is multilingual models, also large-scale evaluation, and equity in technology. So I'm going to start with quantitative linguistics. There are lots of papers that use UD tree banks to make claims about typology or linguistic universals. So Kim Gerdes, I can't remember how he's pronounced his second name, has several papers on this, as does Natalia Levshina. But the general idea is that they take all of the UD tree banks or some kind of subset, and they run some processing and make some graphs, and they say, look, this is how language is. But UD tree banks are still a very typologically poor sample. If you look at, say, I think the Gerdes paper was about reproducing Greenberg's universals. And if you look at what Greenberg had, he had a much, although he had fewer languages, the like typological range was much bigger. Like he actually tried to make them from like a very wide typological range. In UD, and you could just say in name a thing, most language areas are underrepresented, and many large language areas are not represented at all. So for example, Mesoamerica, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, for example. And as an example of this, how it might be useful, we can look at word order in Huave. So I showed this slide to a friend of mine, and he said, oh, looks like verbs are being promoted steadily since the 1980s, which made me laugh out loud. But yeah, so Wals goes with the SOV. They've gone all out for the Stairs and Hollenbach 1981. But if you look at, Jorge Suarez, he goes, no, it's SVO. And then my friend Samuel Herrera Castro did his master's and PhD theses, and he's definitely down for, like, it's definitely VOS. And everyone is working with like a tiny sample of the language. Like the Stairs and Hollenbach, the Stairs lived it with the Huaves for a long time, like 20 years or something, but still, like the amount of data they were working with in any point was quite a small amount. And also, they were dealing with like their own biases at the same time, right? So if we had a tree bank, we could like determine this once and for all, which would be very nice. I think it's probably VOS, by the way. So I think we can say that most UD tree banks are for European or European adjacent languages. And that's more or less a fact. I'm going to make a claim is that multilingual models work poorly when they're confronted with language data and languages that aren't represented in their training data. I think that's a fairly reasonable claim, but I'm not sure it's exactly a fact yet. So I took UDFI, which was trained on UD 2.3, and I ran it on all of the languages between UD 2.3 and I think it was UD 2.8 that had more than 10,000 tokens of training data. And then I plotted this on this funky polar bar graph. And we have the European languages in red and the non-European languages in green. There are two Mesoamerican languages here. So we have Western Armenian is the clear winner. But then there is an Armenian tree bank. So an Armenian tree bank was used in the training data. So that's not super fair. Icelandic, you have all of the Scandinavian languages in the training data, apart from Icelandic. So that's also pretty good. Albanian is just crazy easy to pass, apparently. But then it's also like a very standard average European language. So if you think about like the Balkan Sprachbund, about 4 cases, definiteness, synthetic verb constructions, etc. It's a very like European-y language. And so one would expect that you get good results because you're passing with like mostly European-y training data. Welsh is probably the most European-y of all of the Celtic languages. And then we get into the middle. So Komi, I've called this European adjacent. It's Uralic, it's like related to Finnish, and it's been sitting next to Russian for a long time. And then Manx is kind of an outlier here. Don't know what's going on, but if you look at Nahuatl, Quiche, Guarani, and Wolof, like the results are pretty terrible. And if you compare, like there is 0 Albanian in the training data, and it does this well for Albanian. There is 0 Nahuatl in the well, actually there's Spanish in the Nahuatl, and so there is some Spanish in the training data, but there's very little Spanish in the Quiche, and look at how well it does. So I think it probably matters what's used in the training data of our multilingual models, and I think it also matters that, or it's also notable that just adding more languages without thinking which ones we're adding isn't necessarily going to improve the results for Quiche and Nahuatl. Like probably adding some language with those features is going to help out more. This was a very quick experiment, and so there are lots of caveats. They could just be annotator quirks. So I was involved in annotating both the Quiche and the Nahuatl. So maybe UDFI is just not annotating like me. But then I wasn't involved in the Wolof or the Guarani. So I don't think that's exactly the reason. It could be that there's a massive domain mismatch between the training data and those languages versus the Albanian and stuff. Like it's all news in the training data, and then we're giving it like spoken data. But they have a similar domain profile, and a lot of the sentences in the Quiche and the Nahuatl are like pretty basic, like grammar book type sentences. So you would expect those to work pretty well anyway. And it could also be some other factor that I haven't considered. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I'm also thinking of like some way to make these results more convincing. So any thoughts on that would be great. So I think this is also a problem for large-scale evaluation. Like there's lots of focus on multilinguality, and the Connell-U evaluations and IWPT have looked at doing like massively multilingual evaluations of passing. But again, if you're mostly passing European languages, you're mostly passing standard average European. What does all of these languages tell you really about how the passing technology works for human language? Like if I can pass Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish well, does that tell me anything above just saying I can pass Swedish well? I don't know. And here's a thought, like could shared tasks have tracks for typologically or geographically balanced passing or evaluation? I think that will be an interesting question. And also finally, equity in technology. So having a tree bank, and this is one of the many reasons I work on tree banks, with the advent of software like UDPipe and UDFI, et cetera, having a tree bank basically gives you a gateway into having the entire NLP pipeline. So I'm old enough to remember when like people were making like individual tokenizers, taggers, and parsers, and you had to like put everything together with like a heap of awful scripts. That's not really necessary anymore. You make a tree bank and like you automatically have like excellent tokenization and part of speech tagging. And maybe you have like passable dependency parsing. But like it basically turns it from being like a year-long or 2 years long development process to being a 3-month-long development process. And that means that we can do many more languages much quicker. So that's the part on why this matters. Now I'm going to talk a bit about representations and some consequences of those. And I'm not going to talk about constituent order, polyperson agreement, head marking, or contact phenomena, because universal dependencies deals with those very well already. So it's nice having a slide where you can tick things off and say, hey, we don't have to worry about that because it's already done. But relational nouns, incorporation of variation, I think there are some improvements that we can make, and there are some things I would like to point out. So starting with relational nouns. So this Quiche example is a really good example. And I guess this one works more or less like in English. So it's, I speak with my mother on the telephone. Here you have like a traditional prepositional phrase on the telephone. And this is a relational noun phrase with my mother, where you have a possessive agreement. And a similar example in Nahuatl on the right. In many cases, multilingual models are unlikely to have these kind of structures, and especially with the frequency that they appear. So if you look at bare prepositions in English versus complex prepositions, I'm guessing that the bare prepositions are way more frequent than the complex prepositions. Whereas in Quiche and in the other Mesoamerican languages, this is reversed. So the complex prepositions are way more frequent and the bare prepositions are very rare. And this is likely to result in misparsing. Wait, I think I maybe skipped. No, I didn't skip a slide. Yeah, this is likely to result in misparsing. And probably the solution is just to have more training data with these kind of structures in. Oh, I flipped the order of them. Okay, so the reason we do this, well, there are very many reasons. You saw some of them before, is that this works the same as genitive possession and has all of these other kind of features, like being able to be split or inverted, etc. So with incorporation, we handle it in the enhanced representation. So we make an empty node where it has the same lemma as the incorporated object, and we add an arc saying this, it has this function. This has the advantage of maintaining lexicalism in the basic layer and complying with the guidelines, and has the disadvantage in that some of these arguments are then not available on the basic layer, like you have to have the enhanced layer. Also, a consequence of this is that very few existing systems output the enhanced representation, and we still don't have any real guidelines for the enhanced representation. Like, I don't know what I would call what we have to describe what to do in the enhanced representation, but there's definitely nothing that I would call guidelines. So this basically means that anytime you have an incorporated object or adverbial or whatever, this information is not available to downstream tasks, which is very sad because that's probably useful information. And finally, variation. So most tree banks use this typo equals yes and correct form for dealing with variation spelling and stuff like that. And there was a long discussion on the GitHub between Nathan and Amir on if this is the right thing to do and how to do that. But for the Mesoamerican languages and for Nahuatl in particular, this is not really socially linguistically ideal because these aren't typos. This is just people using a different orthographic standard. And if we had maybe 80 million speakers and lots of text, it wouldn't matter because your model would just magically learn all of the mappings. But if you have, I don't know, 20,000 speakers of the variant and like 5 people writing it and everyone's using a different writing system, that's a problem. So we're using normalized form and normalized lemma in the MISC column. And we tried, for example, doing parsing using those instead of using the originals, and we get much better results. So I think like a 2% improvement in labeled attachment score. But still, this is not ideal. It's in the MISC column, so if you want to do anything with parsing, you have to fiddle around and move things. So it would be nice to have some standardized way of including this information. And then, of course, with this, you have to choose one of the standards, and that's also a problem. Because if you choose the wrong standard, someone's going to say, I don't want to work with you now. Yeah. So yeah, most models aren't set up for this kind of variation, and so the information goes unused. But you could say that for basically anything that goes in the MISC column. So maybe we just need parsers that are cleverer about the MISC column. So now I'm going to give some concluding remarks. First, I'm going to talk about some future work, and then I'm going to talk about like a broader research program, and then give some real concluding remarks. So we'd like to further develop the enhanced representation to bring languages close together. So I think there's some way of dealing with these complex prepositions in the enhanced representation. And I think that's probably the best place to do that. And so we would like to include that information, add more languages, so at least one from each major family, and then develop and publish specific guidelines for Mesoamerican languages, also in Spanish, because most of the people who are doing linguistic research work who are native speakers are bilingual in their language and Spanish, and not like super fluent in reading English. Then like a broader research program, I'm extremely interested, but this is of course like more work than one person could do in a lifetime. So consider this to be an invitation to work on this as well. Historical tree banks of Mayan and Nahuatl will be very, very interesting, especially if you could somehow encode the Mayan hieroglyphs. Having a dependency tree over those symbols will be, let's say, a before I die thing. Like I'd definitely like to see that. And then in terms of synchronic tree banks for macro languages and parsers for macro languages. So having 30 variants of Nahuatl and 30 tree banks I think that's a good idea, but I also think that it's worth looking at parsers that can take in all of that information. And then quantitative investigation of language contact and change, and this requires kind of the historical tree banks. Nahuatl has changed an awful lot in the past 500 years, and it will be very interesting to study that. So I've presented Mesoamerican brief and given some characteristics of the language area, and I've motivated why attention to this is important in both parsing and other natural language processing research, and I proposed some annotation standards and outlined some future directions of research. And with that, Tlasokamatiktsin, which is thank you in Nahuatl, Sibalak Machosh, which is thank you in Quiche, and Ndios Mungui Ikon, which is thank you in Huave. And I hope this is right in Czech. Maybe it is. Thank you.